I'm John Eldridge, president of the National Railway Historical Society's DC chapter. Tonight, I'm moderating this presentation along with my colleague, Thomas. Tonight, our program topic has shifted due to illness. Upon hearing of this change, though, Thomas immediately offered his services. It went something like this. Thomas, what would you talk about that would be of interest to the railroad public? And Thomas said, ties. And I said, ties? How in the world can you interest people on a Friday evening talking about railroad ties? Well, it wouldn't be just about railroad ties. Well, Thomas, what other ties would you include? Oh, there are all sorts of ties. Bow ties, neckties, the Battle of Ticonderoga, tie cob. If this were a formal night, we'd talk about black tie. And if you want to get elemental, we can talk about titanium. But of course, I would save the best for last. I was almost afraid to ask, and what would that be? He said, my ties, aloha. Sorry for all of that. I should have given Thomas the night off. Next time I'll know better. I appreciated Thomas' offer, but we let that one go. And we came up with a very good program. Moving from the roundhouse to the turntable to the main line, we have veteran railroad photographer, John Cowgill. For those of you hoping to see trains, well, don't be too disappointed. His interest in small-town railroad stations will provide a delightful and insightful alternative to looking at locomotives. Thomas, quit your hissing. We all know that locomotives are your favorite. About our chapter. Our chapter's mission is to expand the public appreciation of railroads and their history through preservation and education. We accomplish this mission through a variety of programs, including sponsoring a scholarship to rail camp for a high school student, operating 3 rail cars, including the 2 end cars and our treasured 1923 Pullman car, the Dover Harbor, maintaining a railroad library at Bowie Tyler in Maryland, and publishing our monthly newsletter, The Timetable. Another way we fulfill our mission is by offering free public programs, including tonight's event. Now that COVID precautions are relaxed somewhat, I bet you're all itching to get out and do some rail fan visits to area train stations. Tonight, our member, John Cowgill, will discuss a few of his favorites. John might say that his love of trains started as a youngster growing up in historic Calmer Manor, Maryland, surrounded by 3 rail lines. During those youthful days, he gained a lifelong fascination. Thomas might say it was an obsession. Now, Thomas, can we agree that John has a passion for watching trains, riding trains, and visiting rail stations and museums? Okay, thanks for your agreement on that one. Some of you might know John Cowgill from his blog, John Cowgill, Stories of the Railroad. Others of you might follow John on his Facebook page, John Cowgill, DC Railroad Examiner. John writes periodic articles for the electronic Prince William Living, in which he explores stories of area railroad towns and stations. Tonight, John will tell us tales from some of his historic rail stations he has visited. There's a lot to tell. So now for the main event, please ensure you are on mute. Let's welcome John for a guided tour of some of the historic railroad stations. He might just inspire you to get out there and do some touring yourself. Over to you, John.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Eldridge. My name is John Cowgill, and you heard most of my story. Growing up in a small town that was actually surrounded by a railroad, almost like a horseshoe curve-like, and I grew up actually on a town where we used to see a train cross at a grade crossing every time, blocking traffic. Of course, the grade crossing's not there; it's now a bridge. And I like to do a lot of things, trains, take photos, ride trains, and visit railroad sites like this particular train station here. This is in Marlinton, West Virginia, which is now home of an art gallery, and the main railroad line is now part of the Greenbrier River Railroad Trail. And you see a lady walking her dog in the picture. But I've always been fascinated with all kinds of things railroading, and I always like to see the old railroad stations, even though many of the railroad stations are just like this one here in this photo. But they've all been preserved for people to see for many years to come. But first, we're going to actually start in the state where American railroading actually started, and that is in the US state of Maryland. And we're going to be going to 4 railroad stations in this state. And the first one we're going to go to is the one in Ellicott City, Maryland. This is the oldest surviving railroad station in the country and one of the oldest surviving railroad stations in the world. It was built in 1830 by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which is America's first commercial railroad, which started in Baltimore at the spot where is now the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. And today you can still ride that train for about 1.5 miles. The railroad line in this picture is actually behind the station. And the thing about this station, like many stations, many people in the old days, the ticket master actually lived here, had a bedroom, kitchen, bath, and also the ticket office. And you see a lot of that, this particular train station, which also has the freight house, which is to the right of the photo. And the next place we're going to go to is the town of Brunswick, Maryland. This is a much smaller station. It was actually built in 1851, pre-Civil War. And the interesting thing about Brunswick is it was a town that was founded on both the C&O Canal, which is not too far from this train station, and by the railroad. This was once a major railroad town, and even though it still is today, the town once had a roundhouse, which is now gone. And it was also a major railroad yard, and only a portion of the yard remains today. Much of the railroad that is now a parking lot for the commuter train station, which only stops at this station. From Brunswick, we head to the town of Mount Airy. And this is a town that was actually built around the railroad, like many small towns were. And today, this station, the railroad tracks no longer come to this town. And the town now houses a small pharmacy, and it also houses the Mount Airy Museum. And it tells the history of the railroad in this town as well. Now we go to Maryland Eastern Shore to a town called Ridgely. And this town was also a town that was actually built around the railroad. And here's the old train station. And it has a small museum. It's open usually the first Saturday of every month from March to like October. And the thing about this railroad is it served a lot of farmers. And there was actually a rail line that you see. The line is no longer in service, and the part that goes through the town is not a rail trail. But when this line was active, it connected to the main line, which goes down the Delmarva Peninsula. And what actually killed the service on this line was the fact that the Chesapeake Bay Bridge was built, which made it easier to get stuff from this town to the town of Ridgely. Unfortunately, there's no railroad that crosses the Chesapeake Bay. Like I mentioned, it's now a museum, and it's also part of the Ridgely Railroad Memorial Park, which remembers how the railroad built this town. Now from Maryland, we go into Pennsylvania. And the interesting thing about the state of Pennsylvania, it has the second number of all train stations in the United States. But we're only going to visit a handful of them, because if I told you about everyone, we'd be here till February, and we can't last that long. But we're going to start first with the Darlington train station, which is actually now in the town of Ligonier, Pennsylvania. And the interesting thing about this one, it was on a line known as the Ligonier Railroad, actually the Ligonier Valley Railroad. And it was a narrow gauge railroad which went from the town of Ligonier to the town of Latrobe, which is a town east of Pittsburgh. And it was like I mentioned, a narrow gauge, one of the few in the country, on the eastern United States. Today, this is actually a train station that is actually a 3-story train station. And where you see the cars is where the tracks would have gone today. It's now the Ligonier Valley Railroad Museum, and it's open year-round, usually from Wednesday to Sunday. And it's a great museum if you ever get a chance to visit. So even if it's wintertime, you can actually still visit this place. Now, this is a very good train station. This is an area called Hanover Junction, which is in Pennsylvania. It's in south central Pennsylvania. The railroad, and what's interesting about here is when Abraham Lincoln came here to change trains on his way to Gettysburg, and he was making a very famous speech. I don't know if any of you ever heard of this thing called the Gettysburg Address, but that's where he actually changed trains. The track that goes to Gettysburg is long gone, but the track you see in the photo is actually run by the Northern Central Railway, which is actually the original railroad that ran past this train station. But today it's now a railroad, excursion railroad, which was originally started as Steam into History, which is a newly built steam locomotive. And today you can still take trains here, and you can actually go all the way up to the town of Seven Valleys. And now the next one, this is called the Lincoln train station in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And it was here where Abraham Lincoln deboarded the train. Those are still active tracks. However, the train station is now a museum. No train stopped there anymore. But he got off here and walked a few blocks to prepare the address. And then a few days later, he was given the famous address. And it's now a museum, and it's open usually from March to about October. And this is one I actually discovered. This is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I love how the station looks. The railroad tracks on the opposite side, which you can't see. It was actually a station built in, where is it? Built in 1873 by the Central Railroad of New Jersey, which is the same. The line is no longer active, but you can still get a meal when the restaurant is open. And then now we finish up. Some of you may be fans of the old East Broadtop Railroad, which started running again. And this is the train station, the Orbizonia train station in Rock Hill, Pennsylvania. And today it is still the train station for the East Broadtop Railroad, which I think they might have their steam locomotive running pretty soon. But the station now has a gift shop and the offices for the East Broadtop. Now, we're going to West Virginia. And the interesting thing about West Virginia is it was actually the state, well, actually when the railroad first left the state of Maryland, it went into Virginia. The thing is, now West Virginia was originally Virginia, so you can also say, well, West Virginia was the second state to see a railroad in the North America. And here is the one called Thurmond, West Virginia. It's a town in the New River Valley, which recently, I think it's been a national park for a few months now. And this train station is still an Amtrak stop. It's the second least used Amtrak stop in the country. It was built in 1905 when it was a train station, but now is a visitor center for the National Park Service, only open during the summer months. And if you ever visit Thurmond, it's definitely an out of the way town, because you go down a narrow road it's literally about 5 miles from the nearest major highway. And what is behind me is the facade of the old stores that once made up the town of Thurmond. The tracks today are now run by CSX, and if you're lucky enough, you can still see trains go by. And the railroad bridge you see on the right of the picture, that is actually crossing the New River. And, you know, it's a really beautiful sight if you ever get down here. This is the town of Berkeley Springs, which is in the northern part of the state of West Virginia. And it's actually near where, some of you know where the state of Maryland, that narrow ridge that divides the panhandle of Maryland from the rest of the state. This is actually just south of there. And this station actually was the end of a spur line, which the spur line is still active, but it now stops at a mill just north of here. The tracks don't come down here anymore, but some of the old railroad beds still exist. And what's interesting about Berkeley Springs is people came here to go to the baths, which is now part of the Berkeley Springs State Park. And it's also where people would come take a bath in spring-fed baths. And it's also a place where you could see George Washington's bathtub, where former President George Washington took a bath. You can't see him do it today, but you can see his actual bathtub. And some people actually come here to put their feet in the water. And yes, they will even do it in the middle of January, when even though it's freezing cold outside, the waters are still warm to put your feet in. Now, this is in the town of Durbin, West Virginia. And this train station was actually the home to the Durbin Rocket until last year. The Durbin Rocket now runs out of Cass, West Virginia, and now runs in sync with the Cass Scenic Railroad. But when the Durbin Rocket ran out of here, this train station has has a museum, and it's a really nice little place. I don't know what it's being used for now. I don't know if the museum is still open. The tracks went north of here, but south of here is now a rail trail from the original railroad line. And here is Cass, West Virginia, originally built by the C&O, but now houses the Cass Scenic Railroad. And from here, let me adjust a little bit. You know, the train station also has a gift shop. And the railroad, if you go straight ahead on this picture, becomes part of what is called the Greenbrier River Trail, which is the same rail trail that goes past the station that you saw on the first slide. But today it's home to the Cass Scenic Railroad, which goes to the second highest peak in West Virginia, and now the Durbin Rocket, which runs along the Greenbrier River. Another thing about the Cass Scenic Railroad, it was a logging railroad, and logging was very big in this area. Today it's just tourism, and what's interesting is sometimes when you visit Cass, you occasionally run into people who actually worked on the railroad itself. This is the train station in Elkins, West Virginia, and even though it's still a train station, it's not a regular passenger station, but it's also a station for what is the Mountain Railroad, which basically makes up the Sheep Mountain Salamander, the Tigard Flyer, excuse me, and the Mountain Explorer. And they're great trains to ride if you ever get a chance to get out here. The tracks actually end here. What goes north of here actually is a rail trail. It was part of the original Western Maryland Railroad, but it was also home to the Pittsburgh and West Virginia Railroad as well. And south of this station is the West Virginia Railroad Museum, which doesn't have railroad stock, but it does have the history of the railroad in West Virginia. And behind me, you can see the foundations of the old roundhouse that was once here. So we now go to the state of Virginia. And most of the stations, as you can see, are in the Northern Virginia. And first we start with Manassas, Virginia. And most people, when they think of Manassas, they actually think of the battle of actually two major battles of the Civil War. And it's the only area where two major Civil War battles took place. But what a lot of people don't know about Manassas is it was actually built around the railroad line. It was called Manassas Junction. And the actual junction itself is, if you look straight ahead, you can't see it in the picture, but that was where it was where a railroad spurs off going east and, excuse me, west. And then that's where the name comes from. And it was also where the first military railroad in the United States once took place. That railroad is no longer in existence. It didn't last very long. But here is where the train station is still active. It has a small museum. It's still an Amtrak stop as well. It's also a commuter train station for the city of Manassas. Now here we talked about the town of Ridgely, Maryland. This is the town of Herndon, Virginia. And this is another railroad that was actually built for farmers. And farmers would actually bring their produce here and it would be shipped away by the train. And some of you who live in the DC area would know that what was the original railroad line is now part of the Washington and Old Dominion Rail Trail. Now, it had different names throughout the years, but the Washington and Old Dominion was the last name before the tracks were taken up in 1968. And today, the station is now a museum, and it's open on Sundays throughout the year and Sunday afternoons. And it's also the home to the Herndon Historical Society. Now, farther down is the town of Vienna. And for those of you who are listening who are from the state of Florida, Vienna is interesting because we kind of call it colonial Florida. Because back in the colonial days, people from like Western New York and Northern Pennsylvania came down to the town of Vienna to get away from the snow. But today, it's just a train station which actually houses a model railroad by the Northern Virginia Railroad Club. And where you see the pavement, that was actually where the same railroad line that went past Herndon also passed through here. Now, one railroad station is also on this line is a town called Purcellville, which is west of Herndon, and it's the current terminus of the rail trail. But Purcellville was also a town that was built around the railroad and also served farmers as well. This is the Fairfax Station, and it's in the town of Fairfax Station. The train station is not in its original location, but it was moved for preservation purposes. The original railroad line is about a quarter of a mile south of where this station is now. But it was made into a museum back in the late 1970s. It still remains a museum today. And it's one of only 3 remaining train stations in Fairfax County, Virginia. But this is the only one that's close to an active railroad line. Another thing about this railroad station is during the Civil War Battle of Manassas, this train station was actually used as a field hospital for some of the wounded soldiers. And one of the nurses who worked at this station was a lady by the name of Clara Barton. Who's Clara Barton? A lady who founded the American Red Cross. That's one of the reasons why they want to preserve this station today. And you can still visit it on Sunday afternoons all year round. Now, this is another station. It's in the town of Luray, Virginia. And some of you may know Luray, Virginia as the home of Luray Caverns. It's one of the largest caverns on the east coast of the United States. And the caverns has a great connection to this station because this station was actually built in 1906. And the thing about the station is it's now the visitor center, and it also houses a small museum. But when it was an active train station, people came here, and when they rode the train to come to Luray Caverns, they got a special discount on cavern tours and got a special discount on hotels. The railroad line is actually behind the station and is a still active line and now operated by Norfolk Southern. And this one is a nice station. This is in the town of Boyce. And it's currently being refurbished because this is the last railway mail service post office in the country. And right now, like I mentioned, it's now being refurbished and they're hoping to make it into a museum. I don't know when that's going to be done. The actual railroad line, you can't see it because it's dark, but it's on the right side of the station where you see the power line. But occasionally they do, usually in late April, they do open it up for tours. And now we're going to actually leave the state of Virginia and we go to Western New York. The last couple of slides in this presentation are various railroad stations. This is in the town of Salamanca, which is in far western New York, a few hours south of Buffalo. This is a kind of strange on how this station is set up because the railroad line is actually to the right. It's now a museum open on certain days in the week, but it's also open from April to October. And part of the future plans for this station is to actually have an excursion railroad that's going to actually come from here and go to a town of Hamburg, which is closer to Buffalo. And then we're going to go back over to Delaware, back on the Eastern Shore. This is the town of Felton, Delaware. And no, it is not named after the actor Tom Felton, for those of you who are Harry Potter fans. The great thing about this station, it's just a station right now, but the great thing about it is the entire town is actually centered on the railroad line, which you see here. It's still an active line. And it's the same line that actually went over that connected to Ridgely. But if you ever visit this town, you'll see the town literally split in half by the actual railroad. And the railroad is still run by Norfolk Southern. Still goes all the way to the southern tip of the Delmarva Peninsula. And at one time, there was a ferry service that took the railroads to Norfolk. But today, the tracks just end down in Cape Charles. Here's another station in eastern Ohio. This is the town of Denison, and it was built in 1873 by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The actual railroad line is behind the fence, which you could barely see the railroad tracks there. And when this was an active station, the town actually got the name Dreamsville. Excuse me. And it got the name Dreamsville because during World War II, soldiers were taking the train to go to their various places around the world to fight the war. Trains would actually stop here, and there were actually women who came out. They were part of the Salvation Army. And I think it was the Salvation Army servicemen's canteen. And part of that was that when soldiers stopped here, they get off the train and the women gave them free lunches. And if you ever go visit this museum, it houses a museum and also has a small cafe, but the museum gives a very good depiction of everything that happened in this town. Now, behind the museum is actually a row of old passenger cars. It has an old hospital car, one of the few in the country, and also has a few locomotives as well. And then our final station, for those of you who ever visit New York City and like to see the Statue of Liberty, this has a very good history. Today is a visitor center for the Liberty State Park. This is also a railroad station built by the Central Railroad of New Jersey, the same railroad that actually went past Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And what was interesting about here is behind me is the city of New York, downtown New York City. To the left of this photo is the actual Statue of Liberty. And the interesting thing is that people would come past the Statue of Liberty, stop at Ellis Island, and get checked in, get all that, and go through immigration. And then some people went to New York. Many people came here, and they caught the train from here to various parts of the country. So it's no longer an active train station, but some of the old railroad terminals behind the station is still there. And they also have a little train on the right side, which you cannot see. So that is the end of the presentation. And here are some more stations here. And now, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them.
Well, John, this is Ann Mason. That was a terrific, quick little tour of some wonderful stations. We have one question from Donna, which is about the engine behind you as you're speaking. And is that the Shea engine in the Cass,
It's not a
West
Shea
Virginia?
locomotive. It's actually, let me see if I can step out a little bit. That is actually from the Hocking Valley Railroad, which is in southern Ohio. It's actually southeastern Ohio. It's southeast of Columbus. And that is their number 3 locomotive in the town of Nelsonville.
Okay. We have another question about Ligonier Station. And why does this station have town signs on the fence? Are there towns that were on the line?
Those were actual original towns that were on the line, and that was actually the town of Darlington. I don't know too much about the town of Darlington itself, but you saw signs on the fence. They weren't originally on, they may have been on the fence in some areas, but yeah, every station always had the name of the town on the depot, like you see in this slide here. I mean, if you want a quick little tour of the stations, the one on the far left is Point of Rocks. The one at the top, you see the one of Hinton, West Virginia. You also see Sudlersville, and that's actually an interesting station. I don't know if they've reopened yet, but that gives you a little, it's actually a museum, and it celebrates one of their heroes. It's a guy named Jimmy Fox, who is a Hall of Fame baseball player. Let's see, the one behind on the top right is the town of Gaithersburg, another town built around the railroad. It's a suburb of DC now. The one at the very bottom is from Bealeton, Virginia. The center bottom is the town of Federalsburg. And the one at the bottom on the far left is the town is from Chesapeake Beach.
Thanks, John. Now, many people are sending in the chat about your nice photos. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you took all these photos.
Well, I'm always a person who loves to take photos. And I got a camera when I was graduated from high school, which is somewhat of a little while ago. And if I could ever show you get my camera around here, I got tons of photo albums. I still print, although not as much as I used to. And when I was a young kid, a few people told me, "Wow, you have a photographic memory." Well, I didn't get my first camera, like I mentioned, until I got out of high school. And I just love to take a lot of pictures. And I try to do as many as I can. I'm looking to go into more photography and do more photos and maybe do some photo books. I've had people say, you got to do some photo books. I got to get into that.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm going to preface it by something that Donna has written in the chat. I mean, she was saying that Cass, West Virginia was a great location to go and visit, and she stayed in loggers' cottages. She even got an opportunity to, when she took the Durban rocket, to sit with the engineers during the trip. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, do you have a favorite station?
It's hard to
I know
say.
It might be like asking a parent what their favorite child is, but go ahead and take a shot at it.
I mean, I mentioned about a station down in Venice, Florida, which is a really cool station. And if you're ever in southeastern Pennsylvania, there is the Colebrookdale Railroad has a station. It looks pretty cool. Let's see what else. And of course, you got Point of Rocks you can see in the picture. And Point of Rocks is actually on a junction. And there's a lot of history around that station as well. It looks almost like a church. I don't think they had church services there. Let's see where else. Yeah, it's kind of hard to say. I love Thurmond, and it's a very beautiful town. Let me see. Of course, there's Kansas City Union Station. If you ever go to Kansas City, it's got a little history there. If I had to pick a favorite, it would be kind of hard. But, it's like you said, it's trying to pick your favorite child. I mean, I do like the one in Ellicott City.
Well, great. Well, thanks very much. I know that Point of Rocks has a little bit of history for Jim and I. One of our friends, Pat and his bride, were married in this station on Point of Rocks on the 1st of January, some odd decades ago. And so it is a beautiful, beautiful station.
It'd be nice if they ever fix it up, because I know it's offices for CSX. It would be nice if they ever could fix it up and make it to its original grandeur, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Mm.
And I don't think CSX is going to pay for it either.
No. But it's such a historic station. But Paul's asking if he really wants to retrace the tracks for the old Pennsylvania Railroad. Do you have any recommendations for him?
It's kind of hard to say, because I know the Pennsylvania Railroad covered a lot of territory, and, Trains Magazine, of course, if you ever go to Altoona, Pennsylvania, they call themselves the railroad capital of the world, but Trains Magazine talks about Chicago. And Chicago has, I know Pennsylvania went to Chicago. I know UNO went to Chicago. New York Central went to Chicago. Union Pacific still goes to Chicago. And I think there's a ton of railroads in Chicago. But as far as like the Pennsylvania Railroad, the best I can tell you is you'd have to see if you can Google it. Now you can see some of the old Pennsylvania Railroad rolling stock at the Pennsylvania Railroad, at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg, which is right across the street from the Strasburg Railroad, and it is open year round. So I know some of you people like Yes, when you get up north, you know, some of these places aren't open year round. Well, Pennsylvania, the Lancaster, the Pennsylvania, the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, gotta get my facts straight, is open year round, and you can even visit when it's cold outside. So, but as far as like the tracks themselves, I mean, you may have to like do a Google search. I know Pennsylvania Railroad covered a lot of area from New York City to down to Washington, D.C. Some of the electrified railroad that's now run by Amtrak was originally Pennsylvania Railroad, and it also went as far west as Chicago.
Great, John. Thanks very much. And I will echo and respond that all of the folks are thanking you for this informative trailway glimpse at some wonderful rail stations, and they all thank you for your photographs. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our MC, John Eldridge.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Ann. I had to tear Thomas away. He was having a pizza and some root beer during the presentation. He enjoyed it. You've captured a lot of clever thought into making these stations and their history that made them functional, scenic, and memorable in so many ways. Thank you very much for sharing. Thomas made a list of those he'd like to visit, and I'm sure every station made the cut. For all, remember our meetings are recorded and uploaded to our DCNRHS YouTube channel. So if you want to see this presentation again or refer to it to your friends or neighbors, it's available. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you've enjoyed the program and hope to see you in September. Good night and be safe.